Our final speaker for today is Dr. Helen Waite. Helen's topic, lesbians, in and out of the bedroom, lesbian sexuality, lesbian existence, and the effects of gender identity ideology. Helen is a later life lesbian, coming out at age 30. Her professional life as a social scientist and teacher focused on feminism, sexuality, and sport. Her activism has been about domestic violence and women's health, and she's currently a committee member of COLE, Coalition of Activist Lesbians Inc, the only lesbian-specific advocacy organisation in Australia. Thank you, Helen.
I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of Kondamuka country as well. I live on their country like Anna, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and future. I also want to acknowledge all the lesbians in the 11 countries that have the death penalty for loving women. Audre Lorde said, "If I don't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive." This is a most powerful truth for me as a lesbian in 2020. And it helps when I'm heartsick for young lesbians like Jay, who said, "When I was younger, 14, I always felt like I had to make a choice. I knew that I was a girl who liked girls, but because of what I was taught, I felt like the only way you could like another girl is if you were a boy." Jane Kelly did transition. Then she detransitioned and is now a lesbian in her early 20s. I'm heartsick because girls and young women are being encouraged to identify and medicalise their way out of being lesbian. Right there in Jay's words, you can hear the power and success of gender identity ideology to delegitimise lesbian sexuality and lesbian lives at the personal level. Me, I'm a lesbian and centred women in my life, inside and outside the bedroom. By speaking here today, a bunch of offensive made-up labels will be hurled around. I'll be a vagina fetishist, a cisbian, a non-heterosexual cisgender binary person, or an effing transphobic bigoted TERF. But I have lived through the terrible times when the law courts in Australia colluded with the medical profession to judge lesbians as psychologically unfit to care for their children. I experienced the exhilaration of books where the word lesbian was used in inspiring ways. I attended very joyous lesbian conferences, dances and festivals in the 1970s, the 80s and the 90s. However, from the mid-1990s until now, lesbians have lived with the dark cloud of demands from men who will call themselves women to access lesbian bodies, spaces and communities. And they have used the law on a number of occasions to try to compel us into accepting them as our lesbian sisters. We cannot advertise events for lesbians born female without being taken to court for discrimination against trans people. So yes, for 25 years, lesbians in Australia have been resisting and rejecting men's demands to access lesbians. However, it's different this time around. Gender identity ideology is being used to dramatically expand the support base that once was from just inside the rainbow umbrella mob. Now the support comes from every key institution in mainstream society: media, schools, the state, politicians, health professions and the family. Building that widespread support has involved delegitimising lesbian sexuality itself, silencing lesbian voices and changing the meaning of the word woman and the meaning of the word lesbian. When a group or class of people are openly delegitimated, it becomes a dangerous authoritarian climate, complete with coerced speech, thought police, and legal punishments. By the way, in case you missed it, International Pronoun Day was October 19. It's the third Thursday in October each year. The demonising process has seen the appearance of a revamped arm of compulsory heterosexuality among medical and legal institutions. Thousands of new female customers like Joe are created for the pop-up gender clinics for children, a level of brutal lesbiphobia that we have not seen before. These medical clinics have the imprimatur of the LGBTIQA++ organisations globally, and this gives credence and legitimacy to the dismissal of lesbian objections and critiques. Lesbians have resisted compulsory heterosexuality for eons, and we're doing it again, even when the word lesbian has become most despised and barely visible. However, here we are this time in the company of many, many heterosexual sisters who are standing with us, and that is an energising experience.
Yay!
So what's happening to lesbians, young and old, across the first world? Well, a lesbian couple, busy health professionals, had a quick catch-up for lunch at a cafe, tried to order a meal and a coffee on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia. They briefly held hands, but were ordered to leave and never come back by the owner. As soon as one of them took a sip of coffee, they left without paying the bill. The 2nd of July, 2020. Alison. Stonewall, the peak organisation, multi-million-dollar organisation for LGBTI++, UK's largest organisation, are trying to have lesbian barrister Alison Bailey fired by her chambers for forming a breakaway LGB group fighting for sex-based rights for lesbians and gay men. The complaint? Trans are not included in the group. Toronto Pride March 2019. Organisers ordered lesbians to remove the double Venus symbols from their banners if they wanted to march, because this long-standing sex-based symbol for women loving women was not inclusive of trans. Wellington Lesbian Radio has changed its name because lesbian is not inclusive. The visibility of autonomous lesbians has shrunk to almost zero in peak LGBT organisations. They are multi-million corporations basically funded by our governments, UK, Australia and the USA. And it's been very pronounced in the last 5 years. The purple bit at the top is the number of mentions of lesbians, and you can see what's happened with the rise of gender ideology and trans activism from within the rainbow umbrella. So how did it come to this? Well, partly through new language, built on a history of trying to deny and control women's sexuality. The idea that girlhood and womanhood are somehow defined by femininity and heterosexuality is extremely sexist. Being lesbian in and of itself has always been a form of unconventionality, so we're absolutely at the coalface of nonconformity. Gender ideology has redefined some of the most basic words about our bodies and sexuality. Crucial to the political aim of retaining the status quo of male power is the obliteration of any reference to biological sex. Sexual orientation used to refer to an enduring pattern of emotional, romantic attraction to persons of the same sex, the opposite sex, or both sexes. The Queensland legislation that was passed this year redefined sexual orientation in gender ideology terms. So now it's not your attraction to other people, it's your own capacity to feel something, but you are attracted to someone of the same gender or different gender, where gender, in other parts of the document, refers to an innate feeling of being male or female. Sex has been eliminated from the definition of sexual orientation, so it's a very short step then to eliminate sex from lesbian sexuality. So a lesbian used to be, or still is, thank you, a female who has an enduring pattern, not a one-night stand, which is all number one is, by the way. You just have the capacity to have sex with someone. A lesbian is basically a homosexual female. Whereas now, a lesbian is an individual who identifies as a woman and is sexually and romantically attracted to other people who identify as women. Lesbian sexuality has been dissolved. And you wonder why we're a bit cross? These changes have meant even further denigration of lesbians who try and retain and object to the dissolution of sex as important to their sexual attraction. The other thing that happens along the way, by changing biological sex into social gender, lesbians have been defined by others, i.e. men in LGBTI organisations, to include people with penises and not a clitoris as sexual partners. And most of the diatribe, the vilification, all talks about penis and vagina, when in fact the most important sexual satisfaction organ for women is their clitoris. And you don't hear a word about it because they can't have one and the surgeons can't create one for them. Changing the language in law, which has been done here in Queensland this year, means that men must be admitted to all lesbian events and organisations. It leaves young lesbians confused and stranded inside the contradictory maze of gender identity ideology. They will call themselves queer and never lesbian. It makes delegitimising lesbian sex easier. It follows then the inclusion of male-bodied people into the class of lesbian women means that lesbians are constantly accused and abused for bigotry and transphobia simply for being same-sex attracted and wanting to retain their same-sex attraction. We can test the validity of these new concepts and definitions by consulting the research on sexual attraction. There's mountains of evidence, from sexologists dating back to Masters and Johnson to Kinsey and many more, that all show overwhelmingly that physical sex bodies are the basis of sexual orientation, attraction and arousal. So, surprise, surprise, nearly all lesbians are attracted to other women born female, not to men identifying as women, and they reject the idea that lesbians have penises. Similarly, heterosexual women are not attracted to women who identify as heterosexual men. So the basis of attraction is the biological attraction, regardless of how the person identifies. These researchers were trying to demonstrate the shocking and widespread levels of transphobia amongst lesbians, heterosexual people and gay men against dating trans people. But what this data actually shows is sex biological bodies and not gender identity are the basis for sexual attraction and dating choices. And you really didn't need to do this piece of research to know that. This level of lesbiphobia is closely related to compulsory heterosexuality, which is much more than a simple sexual desire. It's an institution in which males maintain their power at the top of the gender hierarchy, and that in turn facilitates the operation of neoliberal capitalism. Remember, sex sells. If same-sex attraction is unspeakable, so too is lesbian sexuality. And the logic of gender ideology has forced us back into the closet by insisting that lesbian women and gay men abandon self-definition and sexual boundaries. This denigration of lesbian sex itself didn't spring up in the mid-1990s, although that's when we in Australia became aware of it, when the Constitution for the Lesbian Space Project was changed to include people born male in the category of lesbian. The disrespect of lesbian has a very long history, and you can see the old oppressive ideas in these theories recycled again, upcycled in gender identity ideology. So a quick overview. Sexual inversion came to prominence from 1880 into about the 1920s, and lesbians and gay men didn't have that label. They were called inverts. And the theory was that a lesbian, because she was attracted to a woman, was actually inside a heterosexual male. Does it sound familiar? So lesbians were heterosexual males with a woman's body. Sexual inversion, 1890. Along came Freud, who argued that everyone is born bisexual, and because men suffer and survive the castration complex, they were moral, but women, because they had nothing to be castrated, were immoral, unstable, and emotional. Despite the ethics, Freud spent years giving therapy to his daughter Anna, who turned out to be a lesbian for 57 years of her life. He was unable to convert Anna to heterosexuality. Then came the era of medical psychosurgery and psychology, but particularly surgery, to cure people of their homosexuality. And one of the most notorious ones was Freeman, who used an eye pick and a hammer to go through the eye socket to destroy part of the frontal lobe. Then, along came the second wave of feminism, and fortunately, Adrienne Rich wrote a wonderful essay that outlined the way in which heterosexuality was an institution that was compulsory and had lots of arms. However, the second wave of movement, particularly Betty Friedan, disliked and discouraged lesbians from the movement because lesbians would give the movement a bad name. And that is when the term lavender menace arose, and that's Rita Mae Brown at the conference standing up after they killed the lights at the national conference, from which their issues had been excluded. And queer. Queer rose out of postmodern theory, and where gender identity is an innate internal feeling of being male or female, or a bit of both or nothing. Therefore, same-sex attraction does not exist, and there is no actual objective woman or lesbian. The effect of this is obvious, that this is having a gendered effect, that a lot more, particularly young women, are undergoing surgery in relation to gender identity than young boys. The old and new negative theories about sexuality are in the treatment guidelines for children who are uncomfortable with their sex bodies. It's called gender dysphoria at the moment. We went from the idea that people should have the freedom not to conform to male or female stereotypes and heterosexuality, to promoting anyone who doesn't conform needs to be fixed medically. And that's a huge shift in my lifetime, to go from one to the reverse. And it's young women particularly who are harmed the most. If you have a quick look at these clinical criteria, if a child has 6 of these so-called symptoms for 6 months, they will be diagnosed with gender dysphoria and will be put on the trans train of puberty blockers, then cross-sex hormones. Most girls who are tomboys are now medically diagnosed with pathological non-conformity. Nearly all lesbians I know met the criteria during their childhood or adolescence to be labelled trans medically. There are adults promoting their homophobic ideology and using state-approved medical surgery on children, which happened here in Queensland with the health bill amendments to the health bill. Remember Freeman and his ice pick. Some parents also prefer a child to be trans rather than gay. The mother of trans child actor Kai Shapley said, "I remember even thinking this kid might be gay. I thought that could not happen. That would not happen. We started praying fervently. Prayers turned into Googling conversion therapy and how to make Kai not to be like this. Instead, they found transgender sites, a psychologist, and opted to transition their boy child. He's now a celebrity. A child celebrity. This is a terrible, terrible indictment of the new trans activism. And it's terrible because one of the greatest threats to young lesbians is from government-funded LGBTI plus organisations and their spin-off organisations, so-called helplines for trans children and youth. The signs of me being trans during childhood actually turned out to be the signs of me being a lesbian. And you will see those sorts of comments on the detransition sites over and over. The level of misdiagnosis is unknown because gender clinics are not keeping the data and they have no follow-up data. They cannot tell you what has happened to the clients of the gender clinic 3 or 5 years down the track. These organisations, with the support of the state and state actors like politicians, are allowed to label gender non-conforming children as young as 5 as transgender. All of this is indeed the new conversion therapy for young lesbians and gay boys. So what's lesbophobia? In brief, it's not just another word for homophobia. It's an experience that's unique to lesbians because it's a combination of misogyny and sexism, everyday sexism that every woman suffers through, plus a big dose of homophobia for being same-sex attracted. So lesbian women, for us, our social and political position is mediated by being born and raised female as well as being same-sex attracted. And it's these social and political forces that are totally denied by queer activists. You won't find lesbophobia in any glossary of terms associated with LGBTI. In any handout to the media, to the ABC, you will not find the oppression and discrimination against lesbians included. You'll find biphobia, transphobia, homophobia. You will not find lesbophobia. What has happened by this level of denigration and hostility to lesbians, young women are very reluctant to identify themselves as lesbians. They have a terrible time. They are shunned, they are abused in school, and often physically attacked. And often it's too much for them to bear, and they believe their life would be better if they changed to boys. Not quite one. I started realising I liked girls when I was nearly done with middle school. I knew girls who liked girls existed, but I couldn't imagine that I was one. I couldn't comprehend being a lesbian and the idea that I was a straight guy rather than a lesbian was comforting. In terms of inclusion, the big organisation, the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, prevented the one lesbian feminist who was down to speak this year, allowed actually no platformed her after a petition saying she was transphobic because Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras is inclusive by excluding lesbians, and Ariella was going to talk on why lesbians don't like penis. And that was considered so transphobic. The only event in the Mardi Gras was cancelled. And Ariella was no platform from the rainbow umbrella mob. TERF, if you're a lesbian, it now means you're a TERF. And for all those heterosexual women who are labelled TERF, often the assumption is that you are lesbian. The association of trans-exclusive radical feminists has become so close as a term of abuse that it's now weaponised to use against women of all sexualities. There's some very brave young women who have just started to talk out on social media about their experience of being transitioned, when in fact around 50% are in fact same-sex attracted, much higher than in the general population. Charlie, they have actually tried to take Charlie's detransition site down, and she attracted over 13,000 people very quickly. And one comment I thought was really, really telling. Someone wrote on her site, "I wish I could talk to you girls. I am detransitioning. I've known I was trans since I was 17. I'm almost 22 now, and I realised I'm not actually trans, just a butch lesbian." And that's what ends up making me feel really heartsick about what is being done by the power of this ideology. And when these young people, young women usually, are brave enough to stand up and form self-help groups, the trans activist lobby put this rubbish out. Now, I did go and try to find this morning, but you cannot buy it. A month ago, you could buy that T-shirt on the internet. This flag, I think you can, I couldn't buy it either, but it's circulating the flag, Death Before Detransition. So, telling lesbian women that their sexual preference, which was so hard won in the realm of social acceptability, are transphobic hate crimes because they don't include all the new sexes and the multiple genders, is a co-option and an appropriation of the original social movement that challenged the dominance of heterosexuality and male power. It's been replaced by an ideology that is retro-sexist, regressive, relativist, and dangerously authoritarian for lesbians and heterosexual women. I've been deeply disturbed by the emergence of discredited ideas about sexuality, about how women should dress and behave and accept the reality of lady dicks and lady brains. I'm concerned how difficult it must be for young butch lesbians to stand against gender identity ideology as a 15 or 16-year-old. And I'm saddened by the demise of all lesbian cultural events. Gender identity ideology isn't just a set of abstract ideas. It has been embedded into laws, medical treatments for children, and sex education in our schools. How the politics of sex and gender manifest in our lives has very real everyday consequences for our human rights, as well as the well-being of women and girls. By delegitimising lesbians, gender ideology denies us a voice, a visibility at the political table, and the basic freedoms of speech, association with other lesbians, and the creation of community. It denies the rights of children to scientific information about their biology, sexualities, and it denies them access to evidence-based medicine for their distress about being born female. With so much lesbian and feminist resistance to this ideology, I take heart at Audre Lorde's words. Sometimes we are blessed with being able to choose the time and the arena and the manner of our revolution. But more usually, we must do battle where we are standing. Revolution is not a one-time event.